Boy, you couldn't wait to start the conference off with an economist, and then Mark gave half my presentation, so I'm going to kind of summarize and fit it within the 20 minutes I'm going to be watching the monitor down there. I am an economist, and as Mark so dutifully said, I'm really old, okay? When you start talking about doing things 40 years ago, you know you're not a young kid anymore. That said, we have had 3 transitions that is like going on now. This is the 4th one. We've had 3 transitions in the last 28 years. Okay, this doesn't happen very often. Okay, you had 8 years under Jeb, you had 4 years under Charlie, you had 8 years under Scott, you add that up, there's been 3 transitions in 28 years. Okay, it's a freight train. Okay, they're sitting here right now. They've got an excellent leadership team. Okay, they got a transition team. They're starting doing appointments right now. Okay, you'll start hearing them trickle out. Agency heads over the next 10 days, probably you hear a lot of them. They're starting to hire governor staff. Okay, this week we heard that the governor appointed his chief of staff, and they will go down the line. Communications director, we're all baitingly waiting for budget director to be appointed. Okay. When you get further down the schedule, why that's important is that in early December there will be an inaugural. Okay, in early February, the governor's $90 billion balanced budget has to be submitted by the legislature. December, the inaugural's in January. December, 1 month inaugural. 1 more month, he's got to put out his $90 billion balanced budget. And unlike Congress, this will be a balanced budget. Every governor in the history of the state of Florida has always submitted a balanced budget. Every legislature has always enacted a balanced budget. And when they continue down that list of appointees, okay, you know, right after actuary, the state actuary, they will come to the state economist, okay? And I am an economist. Okay, the hard part of forecasting the budget, forecasting the revenues in the public sector is that it's really hard to deliver bad news. Okay, they really don't want to deliver bad news. If the governor, and I do believe we'll have a new state economist in January because the current one is retiring, when you're going through that interview, it's always a little touchy, you know, when the message isn't a good message. Early on in my career, it was a long time ago, it was like 1973, the 73-75 recession. I was the economist that was the finance and tax staff director in the Florida Senate. And those that have been around as long as I have might have remembered Dempsey Barron was the Senate president, Reuben Askew was the governor of the state of Florida. We were in a 2-year recession, okay, a 16-month recession, overlapping 2 budget periods. And I always dreaded the phone call that I would get to come down and say, brief Dempsey on what the budget's going to look like for the next year. Okay, because in the prior year, Dempsey had told me, the Senate president, he'd said, this budget process is nothing more than a giant poker game. Dempsey was a cattle rancher, you know, good old boy. And he says, nothing but a big poker game, and you blankety economists deal the hand. You either deal us a good hand or you deal us a bad hand, and last year it was a bad hand. So I was coming in to brief him the second time around, okay, the second time around, and I walked in there and he looked at me and he says, well, what's it like? And I said, bad hand. He had 2 consecutive bad hands. Reuben Askew had recommended in his budget deliberations a sales tax increase. And after Dempsey said to me, bad hand, I said to him, bad hand, he said, tell your chairman we're not passing a sales tax increase. And that's how we communicated back in those days, economics. Okay, very simple. To deliver bad news in the public arena, though, we have developed, EDR was a starting point, 4 things to help be able to deliver professional information to elected officials all the time. And it's all public. The first one was consensus forecasting. I was the economist in the Senate, there was an economist in the House, there was an economist in economic and demographic research, there was an economist in the governor's office, and by law today they have to forecast in the public arena and they have to come to a consensus on the national economy, on the state economy, on the budget situation, and on the revenues. It's all public, okay? Secondly, that helps when you make an error to say who made the error. It isn't you that made the error, it's the economist that made the error, okay? It's all collectively, all of them. Secondly, they subscribe to the world's largest international forecasting service in the world, Global Insights out of London. Has the largest staff, forecasts all over the world. They provide 3 forecasts for the nation and help us factor down into Florida what the economy is going to look like on the Florida. And it's posted on the EDR website every year. Okay? Global Insights comes in, and they're also not likely to deliver bad news. Okay? So what they do is they give you a mainline forecast, they give you a 25% today probability of a recession forecast, and then about a 22% forecast today for an optimistic economic forecast. And what does the state do every year? It takes the baseline forecast. Okay? Mark gave you a good overview of where Florida is today in terms of economics. If you factor that up to the national level, where are we today? We all can see a really booming economy. Unemployment's low. GDP is strong. Interest rates are likely to go up because the feds believe it needs to be slowed down a little bit. There are risks out there that we'll talk about at the end, but today the national and Florida forecast coming out of the professional forecasting services, is all good news. Okay? If I would factor down and find my little PowerPoint and delve into a little more detail. This is a chart that tracks every recession back to the Great Depression. If you went back there in 17, this one right here, that was when I was briefing Dempsey Barron. It was a 16-month recession. Okay, unemployment rate, the GDP gap was 3.2%, unemployment rose to 9%. If you would look at since that time framework, there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 recessions. The current one, okay, 18-month recession, 5.1 negative GDP gap, 10% unemployment was, as we all heard, the Great Recession, the worst one since the Great Depression. Where are we today in the recovery? This is a 9-year, 4-month recovery. Why people typically that are evil economists speculate about where the economy is going is because that is the second longest recovery of all time. The official forecast of the state of Florida coming out of the consensus forecasting process is sitting down there saying we're not going to have a recession for the next 3 years. Okay, that's the official forecast. That's also the national forecast coming out of Global Insights from London. No recession for the next 3 years. That said, that will make this a 13-year recovery, the longest recovery of all times, and people that don't believe in trends going on forever raises some speculation in that. But some of the good news is, if you would go back and look at the one that started in 1981, we had a 7-year, 8-month recovery. We had a 10-year recovery in 90, a 6-year recovery in 2001, and we're currently in a 9-year recovery. So maybe we can make the 3-year recovery, but that is the official forecast that they're trying to balance that $90 billion budget against. If you look at that forecast, if you like forecasts, if you want to get some sense for your own portfolio what that looks like, okay, you can go to EDR website. The numbers are up there. You can't read them from the seat you have there now, okay? But you're looking at a very similar picture of today, ignoring risks for the next 3 years. And that's what Governor DeSantis will be looking at when he tries to balance his $90 billion budget. Okay, if you look at the basic model that drives Florida, clearly what goes on at the national level, we don't cause recessions in Florida. Okay, what goes on at the national level factors down, and it's the primary variable that drives, the 245 simultaneous equation econometric model of the state of Florida. Okay, if you sit there and say, what does it primarily drive in Florida? The biggest economic engine we have had in Florida back to 1950 has been population growth. Population growth, population growth, population growth. I'm one of them, grew up in Cleveland. How many did not live in Florida or were born in Florida? How many were not born in Florida? Raise your hand. Right, look around. Okay, you're all net immigration or just temporarily working here. Okay, population growth has been our #1 economic engine, and tourism, and over the 40-some years I've been looking at it, it's not the tourist coming every year. Okay, it's the building out of the tourist infrastructure. It's what you all insure. Okay, it's Disney, it's SeaWorld, it's everything down the beach, it's the condos. Okay, it's the building out of the tourist infrastructure, and then the tourism comes in and fills occupancy. Generates employment, generates new construction, generates a Florida economy that's projected to continue to grow strongly for the next 3 years. If you sit here and look at the Florida forecast, you can go to EDR online, and you can see a 5-year forecast of what Florida's going to look like. You know, Mark may work with us and take his scorecard. That's a good snapshot today down to the county level, and also start looking at the leading indicators that are in the forecast that kind of give us some indication of where we truly might be down the road. If you would sit there and look at, in terms of the Florida forecast, what went on in Michael coming through the Panhandle, you're in that industry that saw that happen more than anybody. It's disastrous over there. But it's a small area in the state. It's low property tax income in the state. The nature of when you have a hurricane hit an area in terms of what goes on in the next 2 years from that area. I mean, I have friends over there trying to help the recovery, and the stories I hear weekly are just heartbreaking. You know, on the same day, lost my house, lost my car, lost my job. You know, living in a shelter, not likely to come out of the shelter for quite some time. Florida Panhandle in the north part of Panama City was probably some of the poorest parts of the southeast. The recovery there is going to be difficult. There are going to be budget issues this year, okay, that will deal with what are we going to do with the school systems over there, what are we going to do with the infrastructure over there, how are we going to help them recover, okay? But in terms of an impact on the state economy, in terms of the impact on state revenue, it's really a fairly small little blip, okay? Because insurance is going to come in to offset some of it, although they weren't well insured, and that recovery in terms of what is going on over there is going to take a while, but not likely to have much of an impact on a $1 trillion state economy bigger than Saudi Arabia. Okay, so the forecast has not factored in at this point in time anything significant happening, okay, from Michael, other than budgetary needs. If you sit there and say, what does our driver look like? Okay, our key driver, where's the good one? Okay, this is net migration. You live, you die, you move in, you move out, okay, and that's your population. The net migration, those that move in and those that move out, okay, back in the 1950s, averaged 163,000 a year for 10 years. Okay, you go up to 1990, 261,000 a year for 10 years. Okay, you go back to the boom starting in 2000 and peaking, you can see in 2003, 345,000 net migration a year, okay? That's a city of 1 million, larger than Jacksonville every 3 years, okay? A city larger than Jacksonville every 3 years. It's been going on for quite some time, okay? That said, when the Great Recession hit, you see 07, 08, that long-standing stream of net migration shrunk to 19,000 in 2008 and started a very slow recovery. We had 4 years of slightly more than 50,000 net migration a year. A key factor, you know, in terms of how net migration works, because it's not widely understood, but if you look at how the flows work in this state and why you get such a big economic impact from net migration, is those numbers are really twice as many moving in and half as many moving out. The twice as many moving in are retirees. So if you would look at the current year, 339,000, double that, that's how many moved in that year. And a third, and that same amount leaving the state looking for higher paid jobs primarily. Okay, that's an economic engine. That drives a lot of stuff in the state. It drives construction, it drives a little bit of tourism. Those are more people to go to our own attractions here in Florida. But I mean, the service industry, the insurance that's needed, the churning that happens, doesn't happen everywhere in the state equally, that net migration. Okay, you go to the Panhandle, there wasn't net migration going on much at all in the part that was hit by Michael. Okay, second economic engine. If you would look at how fast we are growing when you add new births, there was a little table back here that again is a little surprise. I don't know if it affects your industry much, but it affects state government a lot. okay, which is every year there's 250,000 children born. And you go, well, I thought elderly were the fastest growing population. Every year there's 250,000 children born. We're a large state. When you got over 20 million people running around, okay, you get 250,000 children born every year. They're in your hospitals, they're in your social service program. 25% of them are born into poverty. Okay, that's part of the underbelly of what you start seeing as social services in the state budget program. Okay, I'm going to take you to a quick budget overview. If you would look at this, and this is a hard one to grasp, but as you start looking at what DeSantis is going to have to try to get his arms around literally in the next 60 days, and you look at these individual services that state government provides. Services to indigent children. Ooh, we just found out there's a whole lot of them every year, okay? Services to indigent, blind, and disabled, okay? Delivery of services to the public education system, K through 12, universities and community colleges, which is subsidized. And incarcerated prisoners, you have 92% of the state's general revenue budget. Whoa. Okay? That's what we do. We have health and social services, and we have education. We have a little bit of criminal justice, and that's 92% of the general revenue budget. So when you then start saying where we are in the business cycle, booms, busts, how that all works, every recession since I've been looking at this since 6 years worth of business cycles back into the early 70s, this is what happens. Economists never forecast the recession, ever, 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 okay? Certainly not in the public sector arena. You don't walk up to your boss when everything's going great and think, I think next year is going to be really bad. Okay? If you did say that, you hope you have a bunch of economists around you to deliver that message. Okay? So you missed the forecast. That means your budget's in deficit. Constitution says you can't be in deficit. You stockpile reserves up, you use the reserves, and you cut budgets. Okay? You hope you get some federal stimulus coming from the federal government to balance the budget in that year. Okay? That's happened every year. On the state demand side, what happens when you go into a recession on the state demand side? Unemployment compensation goes up, poverty goes up, social services go up, people leave the private school system and go into the public school system. They don't go to the University of Miami, they come up to fairly cheaper FSU in Tallahassee. That shift goes on, so every time you see a downturn, okay, you see a loss of revenue. At the same time, the demand for state services is increasing. And I'm so old, I hope never to go through that again, so I'm hoping the forecast continues for no recession for a long, 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 long time, because it's not going to be a fun time when that happens, and it's not scheduled to be forecasted. It is not forecasted in the state budget for the next 3 years. If you then look at, okay, if that's what the state is forecasting, okay, what's the budget situation going to look like? The green up there at the top that you can't see too well, we divide our general revenue into two pots of money. One is recurring, because we're fiscally responsible, and one is non-recurring. And on the recurring side, you know, we try to balance that so we don't create deficits by taking non-recurring dollars and putting them into recurring programs. And right now, there is a $1.2 billion forecasted surplus. 1.2. You can do everything you had in the current year that was recurring, and you can continue that for another year, and you would have a $1.2 billion surplus, and that's a lot of money. That's a big lot of money. There's a lot of things you can do with it. What the Constitution tells those economists is once a year, second week in September, you got to put out a 3-year financial plan that uses all those forecasts, and you tell the legislature what's going to happen for the next 3 years. These are the numbers they presented back in September. These are the current numbers that are being reviewed by the governor. And the first block is you have a lot of recurring money, you don't have a lot of non-recurring money. Non-recurring money for capital outlay, for member projects, for things like that. The second block here, the second block here is the things you absolutely have to do by Constitution, by federal contract. Very few of those. First is class size, okay? You got a constitutional amendment that says you have to fund class size, so enrollment increases have to be funded. And there's a few other things in there. I don't have time to go over what is happening with millage rollback and ad valorem taxes that go into the public school system, but that growth that comes from new construction and that growth that comes from reappraisal of all of your homesteads, okay, flows automatically into the public school system up here in the critical need. And then you come down here, and these are all the other things you can put in the budget. And what the economists have done is sit there, and this will be the big decision DeSantis has to go through, and they say, let's look at how we have funded universities over the last 3 years. Let's take a look at how we have funded, basic services over the last 3 years. They are establishing legislative priorities of the past administration, and they say, we're going to continue that for the next 3 years. Okay? And when they do that, that ate up a lot of money. Okay? Those are things the current governor will look at and say, don't like that one, like this one. Want to do something different with that amount of money. There's a lot of money to do something with. Okay? And then you get down to the last one down here at the end, and you say, okay, in that world here, what are you going to do with taxes? And on the average, they've given $100 million worth of tax relief every year for the last 3 years. They factor that in. They do trust fund sweeps, which is where they get most of their general revenue from on the non-recurring side. And you get down here at the end and you go, oh, look, we still have a surplus. We took the official forecast. We did the stuff we have to do. We took the past 3 years of legislative priorities. Okay, we came down here and replicated what you've done on the revenue side. We have a surplus. Okay, that's a good positive picture. Okay, that's what you need to hear. The governor can change that dramatically, okay, primarily down here in this side and this side, and he's got a staff he's pulled together. The governor's staff is still there in the budget office from Rick Scott's administration, and they will be cranking out a budget. Okay? If you sat here and said, okay, that's a pretty rosy picture, you have those, Speaker Oliva said, well, maybe I don't want to spend that much money. He can give more tax relief. Okay? There's a lot at stake in this session coming up when you have a new governor looking at old established priorities and a lot of opportunity to figure out what you want to do something different with the revenues of the state of Florida, because right now there's a lot of revenues available. If you come down here and say, well, what happens if we do have a recession? Our reserves are at maximum, okay? We have $1 billion unallocated general revenue. They set aside $1 billion from that revenue estimate last year and said, we're going to save it. They have $1.4 billion, which is a statutory 5% of the budget in the rainy day fund or the budget stabilization fund. The Lawton Childs people don't like me to say this, but they have historically considered the Lawton Childs fund. So we got the $637 million available if it's absolutely necessary. So they have a $3.1 billion surplus reserve. Okay, that if there is a downturn, they're prepared to deal with it on the reserve side. And then in the last 2 minutes and 25 seconds I have risks. Okay, risks. If you're an economist, and we are, my nickname in the first 10 years of my term in state government was Dr. Doom. Why? Every time you turned around, we were in another recession. Every time we were in the world, I was saying, bad hand, Dr. Doom. So you tend to look at these things, but I think everybody in the room, okay, whatever you're doing in your business or in your personal life, need to be looking for indicators, okay? Because right now, the forecast everywhere is good for another 3 years. We know we're kind of like far out there on the recovery side. Makes people like me worry a little bit. So always you're monitoring for, is there a recession? There is some concern about the federal deficit. There is some concern and a surprise that with the tax cut that's been enacted, why we're not seeing inflation rise more significantly than it is, so we're monitoring that. There is a growing increase in the interest rate. Why? They want to slow the economy down, not wanting to see that inflation take off. We could see a stock market crash. You feel like there's one every other day. It goes down 500, and then the next 2 days it goes up 300, up 300 more, and then it goes down 500. I gave up as an economist trying to figure out how to manage my own portfolio. Okay, will we have a trade war? Will there be oil price adjustments? Those are in the Global Insights national forecast. Okay, risk factors to monitor. Okay, if you get down here in Florida, the three drivers that we talked about, population, tourism, and housing. A national recession would hurt us. Hurricanes, Cat 5 in the Panhandle, we're kind of like down there, we made it to October. No, it's not November yet. We're kind of like edgy on Force 5 hurricanes hitting the Panhandle. Red tide, Mark reminds me, has been here since biblical times, but we've had a particularly really bad summer, really bad summer. It affected some places temporarily, with tourism, but it went up the west coast from Naples all the way to Panama City, and then it started coming up the east coast, made it all the way past Palm Beach into Indian River. That said, if it happens like that for 4 straight years, it'll change a lot of stuff. If it goes away and isn't here next year, then it was a 1-year blip. Have to monitor that. Blue-green algae coming out of Okeechobee, they better address it. Freshwater shortage. One of Putnam's big things was he contracted out to see what our water supply and demand was in Florida and came to the conclusion with a decent forecast that we're going to run out of water one of these days. And if you have friends, I have a sports bar in Tallahassee, so I get people from all over the state coming in, and the ones that are coming in from the coastline can show you shrimp that have oil in their gills today. They get probably 10% of their shrimp from the company that I deal with that they have to reject because there's problems with them. There is oil spill still going on out there in the Gulf. So those are all risks. Why do I put them up here with such a rosy forecast? Because that's what economists do. We sit there and we watch those things, okay? But no one in Florida, nobody in the country that is forecasting in the public arena is going to come out and do anything more than tell you those are risk factors. Okay, so it has to be monitored. The chamber wants to monitor it. What are early warning signals? What I have learned after all those years doing budgets, if you do have bad times, it's best to find out about them early so you can take early corrective action than it is to find out when it's too late to do something in that year and you're in big bad trouble. Okay, that's it. My little thing went boop boop. I'll take a question. Seeing no questions, thank you.